thank you for joining us today. Our self-development topic for today is finding focus. And we're going to do that by discussing some common types of distractions. So I purposely chose these backgrounds, which I think make things distracting, but also once you get a hold on the patterns, you start making your way through. So I hope they're not too distracting. So we will talk about some common types of distractions, and we will see how they sort of feed off of each other, how they all together work together, and how we can counteract their effect on us so that we can lead meaningful lives. And this talk is based on this amazing self-help book that I read a few years ago called Managing Your Day-to-Day by Jocelyn Glei. Let's talk about the first type of distraction. It is the information supply. We live in a very complex world, right? And we have access to the news across the whole world, or we can quickly see, chat with, or talk with people wherever they are, whenever we feel like, right? And we can look at pictures, we can look at videos, and all of this amazing information has a downside to it. Rather, I should say it's not the information that has a downside, but the accessibility to this information. In a study done not too long ago in 1971, Herbert Simon found out information is bad for concentration. And that's because when our minds confronted with information, they lose focus of anything else. Once we see a bit of information, a bite of information, either in the form of news, images, we lose focus of everything else that's around us. So this ability, it helps us focus on that bit of information. But if that bit of information itself is not useful to us, it leaves us distracted, right? And in this world we live in, we're not just confronted with one byte of information. We're confronted with megabytes and gigabytes of information, right? If I were to use that technical term. So that leaves us so much more distracted than I think we ought to. So one way we can save ourselves from being distracted is by being mindful of people we follow on social media, on the internet, of news groups, of web blogs, right? And similarly, we can also be mindful of the people we interact with in our daily lives. Like as I put together this slide, I couldn't help but think of this one colleague I had in my job a few years ago. So when I got hired, they told me I had the best seat on the whole floor. And it was a pretty big floor in this great ad agency. And they thought it was a good seat that I got because I got to sit besides this extremely popular person on this floor. And 2 days into that job, I realized that was the worst possible place for me to sit, because this person loved to share everything. As they're working on, they like to share what they're working on real time, right? They don't wait for the coffee breaks or the lunch break. They like to share what they did over the weekend. They like to share what their friends did over the weekend. So I had to gently draw a boundary, right? I had to tell my friend that, hey, I like your presence, I like your company, but I can't focus when we're talking. So, so if you see me wearing headphones, that means I'm working. So we can save this conversation for later, right? So doing that in person might be easy, might be difficult, but doing it virtually, I think is difficult. It takes some degree of mindfulness because you're right, like things are happening across the globe, across the country, wherever you're residing. I'm sure there's something that vouches to grab your attention. So the author says, and I agree, we need to in some way be mindful of that flow. If it's in real time, we can tell that person. If it's virtual, we can just set our device to do not disturb. We can just unfollow that person or that web blog. Like for me, I love cars, I love technology, but I have to set a limit for myself, right? I can't read every blog there is about technology, even if I work in technology. So the fact is everybody has access to information, but not everybody has is able to sustain their attention by saying no, by being mindful. So if you develop this quality of being able to be mindful by saying no, by unfollowing, or just by keeping away your device, you have a good advantage or a competitive edge in terms of corporate speak. But I don't think of it as advantage or competitive edge. I think it's just a prerequisite. I feel if you have a lot of information, I think to be able to lead healthy, balanced lives, we also need to be able to balance the inflow of that information, the diet of that information. So, talking about supply of information, let's talk about something else that also is in large supplies around us: requests, urgent and important requests. Doesn't matter if it's in an office environment or in household environments, or in, let's say, in a grocery store. Usually there's lots of requests, more so, let's say, at work, also in households, right? Somebody might come up in the form of a message, phone call, email, with something that needs urgent attention, like, hey, this is an urgent task, can you please work on it? But the fact is, not every urgent task or request is important, and not every important task is urgent. Sometimes they are. Sometimes an urgent task is also important. But I think a happy, successful, productive person is that who can know if this task is only urgent, if it's urgent and important, or if it's just important and something that can be prioritized for later. Right? If we just keep running behind everything that seems urgent, we're gonna, I think, keep running around and not get things done. There's something that I think we all, at some point exhibit, which is perfectionism. We try to do everything to the best of our abilities, but let's face it, we're limited people. We have limited time, so we can't necessarily say yes and do everything perfectly. And these urgent messages or urgent requests, they exactly target those people who are trying to be perfectionists. They try to deviate you from what you're trying to do by seeming urgent, even if it's not important. And as we just discussed, yeah, we can't do everything perfectly, or we can't just, even do everything even one bit. So what's going to save us is this ability of knowing what's important versus what's just urgent but not important. Something else that I think goes back to, just like how these urgent calls to action prey on us trying to be perfect, there's something else that harms us in the long term, which is overestimating what we can do in the short term, but underestimating what we can achieve in the long term. Right? I feel like there's so many times when we feel like, oh, if I only had a few hours or a few days to work on something, I'd do it perfectly. And maybe we actually do get those few hours or few days to work on that, only for us to realize, oh, wow, this request, this task that we need to work on, maybe it's a spreadsheet, maybe it's a special, I don't know, muffin that we need to make for our friends who are visiting. It seemed pretty simple on that YouTube video, but now that I'm actually making it, it's actually not that easy as that influencer made it sound like, right? And maybe we actually can achieve that in the short term. We can actually bake that amazing batch of muffins, but then we have to say no to other things that we also had to achieve in that limited amount of hours, right? So, and so the reason why we actually forced ourselves to work on that difficult thing in the short run, but then the reason which also made us say no to the other things that also had to be worked on, is fear and lack of planning, right? Because I hadn't planned for these muffins taking longer than I had thought for, right? And because I feared that, oh no, if I don't make these right, my friends or like my mom who's visiting is gonna judge me, so I better get it right, right? That fear forced me to just, make sure that the muffins came out somewhat edible, but then everything else completely was overlooked. So when my friends visited, it looked like I just got up because my apartment wasn't in order. So yeah, so fear and lack of planning they sabotage us in the long term, because when we do things out of fear, right? When fear drives us, it doesn't allow us to plan for anything else, for plan B and plan C, right? And if we use fear to drive us, like if I'm afraid of not being seen as the brightest person in class, and if that fear is what drives me to get a good GPA, it's not going to give me the imagination to build a vision of what I actually want to do once I get the degree and also the job that I want, right? What then is not the question I would ask myself if I'm driven by fear. Let's talk about something else, right? We all have unique fears, and I think these fears are generally of two types. One of them is the fear of not being enough. Like when I was in school, I always was afraid of not being tall enough because I wasn't the tallest person. Today, I'm fine with not being the tallest person. I'm pretty comfortable in long distance flights because I'm not extremely tall, right? Um, but So, right, so these fears are unique to us, but what's not unique to us is all of us have fears. And it's, one thing or the other. We all have some sort of complexes. And these fears, I think, become more vivid when we set out to do something, to deliver something to the world. So it can be this batch of muffins, or it can be this analysis on a spreadsheet that I'm about to deliver. So when I go through this whole process of thinking about making the muffins and then actually doing them, I feel these fears really vividly because I'm putting myself in spotlight along with that something that I have just made. And because I, along with my creation, are in spotlight, I'm afraid that the world is going to scrutinize me and my creation similar to how I am going to scrutinize myself and my creation. But this amazing insight that the author shared, which I think anybody who cares for us will tell us, is it doesn't have to be that difficult. And the way it won't be as difficult is by knowing that, yes, this whole process of feeling like we're not enough, of having some sort of complex. That's the whole process, and it's okay to feel sensitive. It's okay to feel conscious. And then once I'm okay with being who I am, with being sensitive, I also realize, hey, it's also okay to not make the most perfect batch of muffins, to not chase this ideal, almost fake image of what perfection is in my head. And it's okay to just if I'm doing something for the first time, it's not going to be the best version of it that I can make, and it's okay to be that way. And despite me knowing this, if I still feel some sort of complex, if I still feel like I'm not enough, or like I'm too much, like I another fear I had was that I was really loud, I was really chatty in school, so I always had a fear that I'm too loud, right? So it's okay to feel sensitive about these things, because that is the whole process. So the way all of these different distractions, the way they work together is as such, right? So the information oversupply along with this abundance or this oversupply of stimulus together, they in some way affect us. They affect us emotionally, like they affect our fears and our really complex emotional psychological selves, which is why I guess they're called complexes. And the world we live in right now, it, in some way, I think, I don't know if it's conscious or it's subconsciously, but it's tailored to target those fears and those complex selves that we embody. And the way to not be jarred, to not be affected by this whole cycle, is by accepting our complexities, our own fears, and that way we won't be dictated by this information and by all this stimulus. So my right, the conclusion is not that this information supply or this stimulus that's around us is all bad, right? The stimulus around us can actually spark inspiration within us, and information is everything. Like this complex world we live in sustains itself on information. Like right, like we need this information, let's say, to balance this ecology that we live in. So not all of it is wrong, but being driven by it, trying to chase everything, trying to finish everything perfectly, is, I think, something unrealistic, and that's what we need to be aware of. So thank you for hearing me out. Please visit our website for additional videos, and I'd like to know, what are some things that distract you?
Scar, thank you for that, Apurva. It was a nice overview of information. And sorry, there's something stuck in my throat. What it brought to mind for me is in yoga, we have this concept called pratyahara, which means withdrawal. So the practice that we specifically are doing in the meditation that we're practicing, doing, learning in Vistara Circle is a type of withdrawal from the world. That's what the visualization does. You know, you're imagining you're in this dark sky and there's a point of light. And so we all need a practice of withdrawal so that we can then come back and focus in the world. Because if you're in a constant state of overflow of information, like you don't ever get a break. And we all need a break. We all need a rest. So that's one thing that came to mind. And what was the other thing? I don't remember. It'll come to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me know whenever. I think, something you said made me remember of this. A conversation I had with my friend last year, because it's 2021 now. We were talking about, meditation. And he said that he doesn't like the idea of meditation because he doesn't want to avoid what's happening in the world around him, politically, right? Geologically, in every way possible. Which made me realize how I think a lot of people might think about meditation, spirituality as escapism, but I don't think that's what we're trying to practice, right? I think we're trying to strike a balance between knowing enough and knowing too much, right? And when we get to that balance of just knowing enough, we actually retain our energy, our vitality, our time, resources for doing something about it instead of being overburdened by the inflow that leaves us paralyzed.
Exactly. And if you think about it with the sponge, if you have a sponge that's sitting in water, it's not going to be able to absorb more water because it's already saturated. You have to wring it out and let it dry before it can then soak up more water. So that's what we're doing when we withdraw, is we are wringing out the sponge so that then you can come back and be more plugged into the world. And you're so spot on of that, the type of, well, tantra, uh, it's a Sanskrit word that means liberation through expansion. And tantra is not a world escaping philosophy. It's not I'm going to close my eyes, be like an ostrich, stick my head in the sand, go meditate in a cave. That's not what this is. This philosophy is very much about engaging in the world. And then the question becomes, how can you engage in a world that allows you to maintain your sanity, your serenity, your ability to serve other people? That's what these practices are doing. It's a way they're tools really to help us cope in the world. And so I just, appreciate your presentation. And I laughed when you were talking about working at the ad agency and you were sitting next to this, like the best seat in the house because you're next to this popular person. And then you realize it was actually terrible because they were too popular and talking too much. It's like, yeah, it's true. There needs to be some boundaries everywhere. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I'm sure like 50 years ago, the challenge was different. It wasn't how do I know what block to follow versus what not. I'm sure it was different. How do I say no to certain group of people the right way without offending them, yet still being in touch.
Yeah. So it's a whole new world of, well, I mean, that's a whole other topic. As somebody who works in the journalism industry, I could just go off about news and the news business and gatekeepers and where we're getting information. And I'm going to find focus by bringing it back to our conversation as opposed to talking about that.
Exactly. Thank you.
Is there anybody else who wants to chime in? Apurva and I are just chatting away over here. We'd love to hear some other voices if anyone has something that they want to share.
Yeah, sure. I'll jump in.
Hi, Al. Good to see you.
Good to be seen. I mean, a lot of you, I guess, aren't necessarily old enough to remember the times before the internet, or working before that time. I certainly do, and it was easier to keep up with information because we didn't have the 24/7 news cycle and instant messaging and email on top of telephone, and just kind of the flood of information that comes in your day-to-day life. There is one interesting observation that I had, Apurva, when you were talking about urgent versus important. That's something I'd certainly heard a point that was made some years ago in some training that I took. But I don't think I really stopped to embrace it until recently with my phone, my cell phone in particular. I grew up with, the house phone, and the phone would ring and someone would say, "I'll get it." And there was always an urgency to answer the phone because somebody was calling. We didn't necessarily have answering machines. And now that there's so many of these spam calls, I've gotten into the habit of just not answering my phone at all because I realized it's not urgent, and if it's important, there'll be a message and I can respond in a decent amount of time. So it's kind of funny that even in this age of information overload, one of the byproducts of that, the robocalls, has actually led me to give up something that I thought was urgent and important and realize that it's not. That's all I got.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. It's so funny. And I'm 36, and so I do remember a time before the internet, and we also had the landline, and there was a time that we didn't have an answering machine, and then we got an answering machine. And I mean, you're right. It was this like special thing of somebody's calling, we need to see who it is. And now with caller ID and voicemail, it's like, well, do I really need to answer this? Probably not. So yeah, that's funny how that changes.